Hello and welcome to Week 13, Philosophy 101, in which we're going to be discussing John Searle's Section 2. For those of you who have already read the chapter, I can understand if you feel it's a little daunting because John Searle does talk about a lot of areas that even a graduate student studying philosophy would have a hard time understanding thoroughly. And John Searle alone could take up an entire class in philosophy of language or philosophy of science. For our purposes, what we're really looking for is his ideas of consciousness and intentionality, and how those things segue into subjective and objective knowledge, or the creation of subjective and objective knowledge. That is the focus of this entire course, so the way I've structured the course. Because we started with Plato and Descartes and their idea of what it means to have knowledge. Then you have Hume's understanding arguing different aspects of knowledge or the criteria of human understanding. So for Searle, we're going to try to stay within the same framework where we're going to be discussing and focusing on consciousness, intentionality, and subjective and objective epistemology and ontology. So this section, this lecture, is split up into 6 different slides, a total of 7, including this introduction. The first slide is going to go over the 3 features of consciousness. And the reason why this is important is because these 3 features of consciousness are necessary for consciousness to make sense at all. And it kind of brings in his entire chapter. Then we'll go into subjectivity and how subjectivity prevents a scientific account of consciousness. And that's where we're going to get into epistemology and ontology, subjective and objective aspects of both cases. And I'll go over what they mean, and I'll quiz you a little bit on the differences between these two. So that way we have a solid understanding, because it is important to understand the distinction between epistemic subjectivity versus epistemic objectivity, and something that is ontologically subjective versus something that's ontologically objective. These are important concepts to grasp, and this is really what I'll quiz you on and what you will be tested on, because they play an important role in the later chapters as well. And then we'll move on to the problems with dualism and materialism. Now, the problems with dualism and his arguing for dualism and materialism took up the majority of this chapter. I'm just going to summarize it because dualism was important in Descartes. We did talk about dualism and the arguments that Descartes made for dualism. And now we're going to discuss a little bit of what Searle talks about when he says there is a problem with dualism and there is a problem with materialism, the anti-dualist materialism that believes all is material. So we'll go over what he means and the problems with that. Then we'll discuss consciousness as a biological process. This is important to understand what he means by consciousness as a biological process. Then we'll move into the irreducibility of consciousness. Now, the reason I focused on the irreducibility of consciousness, so much so that I've actually put it in the slide, is because people have a tendency to put a lot of stock into scientific analysis. And one of the things I enjoyed most about Searle, and one of the reasons why Searle is very prominent, is because he showed that science contains a lot of weaknesses in their ability to prove things objectively. And while nowadays, as I said, a lot of people put a lot of stock into science, the irreducibility of consciousness shows that science can only go so far. I mean, science was once a branch of philosophy, but science focused on testable knowledge. A professor of mine when I was an undergrad really pointed this out when he stated the problems that we're left with in philosophy are those that haven't been solved yet, because those problems that have been solved have branched off to other subjects or other areas of subjects. And one of them was science. Science and philosophy went hand in hand for a while, but science branched off based on a criteria that the only knowledge they are going to focus on is that which can be tested, or testable knowledge. And so we'll end this discussion with consciousness, intentionality, and causation, because intentionality takes up most of the next two chapters. And I mean chapter 4 and chapter 5, since we are skipping chapter 3, because that's very philosophy of science heavy. And so with that, we will move on to the next slide. 3 features of consciousness. Now, before he gets into the 3 features, Searle repeats himself by stating what external realism means. And external realism means that there is a way that things are in the world that is independent of our representation of how things are. This world exists regardless of how I believe the world operates. This is not a theory. It is a background presupposition, something that is taken for granted by us when we perform many sorts of intentional acts. When we go around and we say, "This is my car," we are directing our belief, our conscious belief, towards something in the world to intentionally describe what fits in our mind, or how we see that car as being ours. And there's 2 more propositions, actual theories that he states are not up for grabs. And these are 2 propositions in modern science. And just to quickly go over them, one is the atomic theory, the fact that the universe consists entirely of entities that we find it convenient, if not strictly accurate, to call particles in the fields of force. And then the evolutionary theory of biology, where organic systems have evolved nervous systems, and those nervous systems have evolved what we call minds, human and animal. He says these are theories in modern science that are not debated anymore. They are the foundations of theory. They are needed as background laws or background presuppositions to have theories at all. After that, Searle goes on to talk about conscious experience. And he states that during all of our waking lives, as well as when we are dreaming during sleep, we are in one or more forms of consciousness. And the conscious states have all the variety of those waking lives. So what he's saying here is that even when we are dreaming, when we are unconscious, we are still in a form of consciousness. And when we are awake, we are in a form of conscious life, because everything is presented to us by our consciousness. Our consciousness draws the world around us, makes sense of the world around us. Everything we see needs to be processed by our brain. So whether we are awake or asleep, we are in a specific kind or specific form of consciousness. And then that's when he starts to break down the 3 essential features that are common to all conscious states, whether we're sleeping or when we are awake. And it's important to know these 3 features, because definitions that arise via how we explain consciousness need to include all 3 of these states, or all 3 of these essential definitions, or essential aspects, for that matter, of consciousness. And the first feature common to all conscious states is that they are inner. And they are inner in 2 different senses. The first sense is a very ordinary spatial sense, in that they go inside my body, and specifically inside my mind. Consciousness can no more lie around separate from my brain than liquidity of water can be separated from water, or that the solidity of a table can be separated from the table. Consciousness cannot exist outside of my mind. Conscious states occur exclusively within my mind. So one key aspect to consciousness is that they are inner. And the second sense is that any one of our conscious states exists only as an element in sequence of such states. What he means is, we have conscious states like pain, and thoughts themselves are made only as a part of living a conscious life. Each state has the identity it has only in relation to other states. When I am in pain or in this conscious state of being in pain, it only makes sense as from the point of view that there exists a conscious person to have the state of being in pain. It only makes sense because there is a network of conscious states associated with pain at this time, with the occurrence that gave me this pain. They all exist in relation to one another. And he gives a good example of this when we discuss ontology. So it's just important to understand that when he says inner, he means these things occur within our brain. They can't exist outside of our brain, and these conscious states exist as a sequence of other conscious states. And with that, he brings in ontology. Then this is where the inner aspect comes from, because it's a spatial sense in which it's inside my brain. Ontologically, or its existence. And when you see ontology, you should automatically understand that it means its existence. What its existence depends upon. For ontology is the study of being, and what that being necessarily depends upon. So, ontologically, the very existence of my conscious states involve their being part of a sequence of complex conscious states that constitutes my conscious life. If I really remember running a race, and he's saying here, really remember, not delusion. If I really remember running a race, then I must have actually performed the action of running in an event called a race. And this must have been done by me. So this is the complete conscious state that constitutes that conscious experience. The conscious state of running, the conscious state of being a part of a race, the conscious state of understanding what it means to be in a race, the rules that are involved in the race. These conscious states only make sense as a part in a sequence of other conscious states, and that's what he means here. The second feature essential to conscious states is that they are qualitative. By qualitative, he means that for each conscious state, there is a certain way that it feels. There's a certain qualitative character assigned to it. For this, he uses Thomas Nagel. For every conscious state, there is something that it is like to be in that conscious state. There is something like it is to drink wine, listen to music, in contrast to what it is like to be a house or a rock. A house doesn't feel things. A rock doesn't feel things. When I'm in the conscious state of angry, there is something that it is like to be angry. When I'm in a conscious state of being hungry, there is an actual qualitative state that we can define as hungry. When I'm in the conscious state of being thirsty, There is a description, there is a quality to being thirsty that defines that conscious state. So they are qualitative. There's a quality to these conscious states. It's not just like being a rock or being a house or being dirt. There is something to these conscious states. There's a quality to them, and that's what he means by that second feature. Now, the third feature, and he states that this is the most important for his discussion, because it is, especially for chapter 4 and 5, is that they are subjective. Consciousness is always experienced by a human or animal subject. There is a first-person ontology. Ontology, now, the study of being, its existence is subjective. Its existence is only known by the person experiencing it. Me being thirsty does not rely on your definition of thirsty. My conscious state of being thirsty doesn't rely on anybody else in the world. Its existence necessarily relies on me. That's why it's a first-person ontology, because its existence is predicated on me feeling this conscious state. Without me feeling this conscious state, it is no longer alive. It no longer exists. It is no longer a being whatsoever. So they have a first-person mode of existence, experienced by an agent, by a subject. They exist from the point of view of some agent or organism or animal or self that has them. And this necessary characteristic is very important later on, especially when we start talking about dualism and the way science tries to describe consciousness. But consciousness, my state of consciousness, are to me in a way that they are not accessible to you. You will not have my access to being thirsty. You do not have my access to being hungry. You have your subjective ontology of what it means to be hungry. And you don't have access to mine, even if they are the same. This is one of the consequences of subjectivity. We don't have access to each other's subjective conscious state of being hungry or thirsty. He's not saying that you can't know when I'm hungry. There's a difference between where you can understand the symptoms that usually correlate to being hungry. No, that's not what he's saying. He's saying that the existence of me being hungry relies on my subjective consciousness, because epistemically, and what we mean by epistemically is knowing, in the epistemic sense, you could know I'm having a certain feeling even though I don't know it. You could perceive my conscious state before I even know that I'm having it. For example, I'll give you an example. There's a feeling of envy or jealousy that other people frequently are in a better position to know and identify. Identifying it and understanding it in an epistemic sense, because the epistemic means knowledge. So knowing, they can understand and know that I am jealous, even when I haven't identified myself as being jealous. And you often see this on TV, or maybe you have a friend that gets jealous easy, and they make some snide remarks, or they say certain things that have jealous connotations to them, and then you tell them, oh, man, you're so jealous of this person. It's like, oh, I'm not jealous, I'm just talking. The idea here is that another person can know you are jealous, or you can know, more importantly for Searle, that you're in a particular conscious state without you really realizing it. But that's not what he's saying for a first-person ontology. Its very existence relies on me. Me being jealous or in the constant state of jealousy its existence of a jealous state, quote unquote, relies on me. It relies on me being able to feel that conscious state. It doesn't mean you have to know that you're in that conscious state. It's not in the epistemic sense. There's not a knowledge associated with this. I create it. It's subjectively created. Each of my conscious states exists only as the state because I experience it. It exists, or its ontology is predicated on me. So to summarize, the three essential features of consciousness is that they're inner, they are qualitative, and probably most important, they are subjective. And with that, we'll move on to the next slide. Subjectivity prevents a scientific account of consciousness. So, one of the consequences of subjectivity is that people who practice science believe if we reduce consciousness to a subjective identity, then it can't be studied scientifically, because they run into that old saying, de gustibus non est disputandum, which is Latin for, in matters of taste, there can be no dispute. Somebody cannot dispute that pizza tastes good to me. It's a subjective account. It is epistemically subjective, which means the knowledge is created by me, the subject. So nobody can really argue against it because it's a matter of taste, and matters of taste cannot be disputed. Consciousness being subjective puts consciousness beyond the reach of scientific investigation, according to scientists who believe objective knowledge is the only true knowledge. Now, Searle disagrees with this. But first, he lays out what science is objecting to here. The first premise is science is by definition objective. The second premise is that consciousness is by definition subjective. The conclusion is, therefore, there can be no science of consciousness. Because if science is by definition objective, and consciousness is by definition subjective, they are mutually exclusive from one another. Therefore, there can be no science of consciousness whatsoever. Searle's dispute is that this is ambiguity over subjectivity and objectivity. Objectivity can be known to be true or false independent of the feelings, attitudes, and prejudices of people. He believes we can objectively study things even though they are ontologically subjective or created by subjective people. And this is where we get into epistemic and ontological subjectivity and objectivity. First, we'll discuss epistemic subjectivity versus epistemic objectivity. This refers to knowledge or knowing of a statement. That's what epistemic means. Epistemic, again, is knowledge or the knowing of a statement. So something that is epistemically subjective, the knowledge is subjective, its truth depends essentially on the attitude or feelings of the observer. So something that's epistemically subjective is candy is good. Candy being good is known through a subject. Its statement is true or false depending upon the subject's taste. Another example is basketball is fun. This is something that is epistemically subjective, again, because it's the subject that depends on the knowledge. The true or falsity of the statement relies on the subject that's saying it. The example that Searle gives is Rembrandt was a better painter than Rubens. This again is epistemically subjective. The person creates the knowledge. This knowledge is true or false depending upon the individual's taste. Contrast that with something that is epistemically objective, where the statement is true or false regardless of how I feel about it. The statement of the Atlantic Ocean is on the east coast of the United States. That is something that is epistemically objective. It doesn't matter what I believe. Its knowledge is objective because it doesn't matter what I feel about it. Its knowledge isn't created by a single subject. Hawaii is surrounded by the Pacific Ocean. I wish Hawaii was closer to another land, closer to San Francisco or closer to the West Coast so that I could travel more often. But no matter how I feel about the subject, Hawaii is surrounded by the Pacific Ocean. This is something that's epistemically objective, regardless of how I feel about it. The example that Searle gives is Rembrandt was born in 1609. Again, this is something else that is epistemically objective. So now that we understand what is epistemic subjectivity versus epistemic objectivity, we'll move on to ontologically subjective versus ontologically objective. Now, ontology refers to the mode of existence, its creation. So, something that is ontologically subjective, its mode of existence, its creation depends upon a person. So something is ontologically subjective if the mode of experience exists only as it is experienced by human or animal subject. Its creation, its existence relies on a subject. So when I feel pain, that pain's existence is ontologically subjective. And we've discussed this before when it came to consciousness. Consciousness is ontologically subjective because its subjectivity creates the consciousness. My consciousness is only created by my subjective states. So it's ontologically subjective. Tickles, those are ontologically subjective because they are created by a person. Again, and itches is the same way. Hunger is the same way. These are all created. Their existence is predicated upon a subject feeling them. This is in contrast to something that is ontologically objective, where the mode of existence does not depend on the experience or being experienced by a subject. A mountain, for example, is ontologically objective because its existence, its mode of existence, does not rely on me experiencing it. I don't need to go down to Colorado and experience the Rocky Mountains for it to blink into existence. Regardless of the fact that I've never seen the Rocky Mountains, does not predicate that the Rocky Mountains exists. Its ontology, its existence, is objective. It does not rely on a subject. Some more examples of something that is ontologically objective are glaciers, oceans, lava. I live in Hawaii and I live up in Volcano. And regardless of the fact that I wish lava wasn't up here, that doesn't change the fact that there exists lava near my home. So lava is objective in its ontology. It's ontologically objective. Its mode of existence does not rely upon being experienced by a subject. So now that we understand these, I'm going to quiz you a little because I said I was going to quiz you. These are important distinctions, ones that we should study, and I will put on the test, hint, hint. But I'm going to quiz you by giving you a sentence where both ontology and epistemology, or something that is epistemic, comes into fact. So I'm going to give you 6 sentences. And each one is going to either be ontologically objective or ontologically subjective, and either epistemically subjective or epistemically objective. So there's going to be 2 sides to each of these sentences, one in ontology, the other one in epistemology. So here's the first one. The Rocky Mountains' highest peak is in Colorado. This is ontologically objective because we are talking about the Rocky Mountains, and its ontology is objective because, as I said before, the Rocky Mountains do not rely on a subject as a mode of experience. Its creation does not rely on the subject. Their highest peak being in Colorado, this is epistemically objective because its knowledge does not rely on a subject. It is a fact about the Rocky Mountains that lies independent of my feelings on the matter. Its truth is objective. So the Rocky Mountains' highest peak in Colorado is ontologically objective and epistemically objective. Number 2, Braxton Hicks contractions hurt. This is something that's ontologically subjective and epistemically subjective. Now, it's ontologically subjective because its mode of existence depends upon a subject. Contractions are felt by a specific subject. It doesn't matter that many people feel Braxton Hicks, many people feel pain, many people feel tickles, but its existence is predicated upon a subject or animal experiencing them. That's why they become ontologically subjective. And it's epistemically subjective because not all Braxton Hicks contractions hurt. It is the fact that it hurts is a subjective mode of knowledge. Its knowledge is predicated on a being saying, hey, this hurts. So its knowledge is subjective. Number 3, Rocky Mountains are beautiful to look at. This is something that's ontologically objective, but now we have epistemically subjective. Now, we know why the Rocky Mountains are ontologically objective. We went over that on the first sentence. But now we have something that is epistemically subjective because its beauty is only known by a subject. And its beauty is true or false depending upon whether the subject believes it or not. So that's why, in this sense, it's epistemically subjective. Number 4, Braxton Hicks got their name from John Braxton Hicks. Now, this is obviously ontologically subjective because we haven't changed its ontology from the second sentence. But now we have something that is epistemically objective because this is an epistemically objective fact. This is known regardless of my taste or sense of the matter. The knowledge offered in this sentence does not rely on a single subject. It is an epistemic fact. It's epistemically objective fact. Now we're going to get into some more difficult ones. The New England Patriots won Super Bowl 49. And I can already hear some Cowboys going, oh my goodness. Well, this is something that is ontologically subjective, but epistemologically objective. So you probably want it to be epistemically subjective because it's like, they only won the Super Bowl from another person's point of view. No, this is, unfortunately, epistemically objective. Sorry to burst your bubble. Now, the New England Patriots, though, are ontologically subjective. Their mode of their creation depends upon people creating them. The New England Patriots don't exist as an object outside the world independent of human experience. They rely on human experience. They rely on what we have all created, football, and they rely on what we have created, the NFL. And they exist because we created them. That's why they're ontologically subjective. But the fact that they won Super Bowl 49 is something that's epistemically objective. It is an objective fact that exists out in the world that they did win what is called Super Bowl 49. And regardless of our taste of the matter, its knowledge is known objectively. Its truth doesn't depend upon a bunch of people denying the fact. The fact is they did win Super Bowl 49. And the last one is one that Searle uses often. And let's just visualize, I'm holding a $1 bill before I say this. This is a $1 bill in my hand. This is something that is ontologically subjective and, again, epistemologically objective. That's right. We create objective facts from something that's ontologically subjective. And that's what science had a problem with. The $1 bill is ontologically subjective. We created the $1 bill. It didn't exist out in the world beyond the mode of experience of a subject. No. We created it. Its ontology is subjective, but that doesn't take away the fact that it's epistemically objective. No matter what I say about this $1 bill, it will not turn into $1 million bill. Believe me, I've tried. The knowledge that this is a $1 bill and it remains a $1 bill is beyond my subjective taste of the matter. So now we have something that is ontologically subjective, but we can still gain knowledge or objective knowledge from it. And returning back to Searle, this is exactly what he says when he says there's a fallacy in the argument of the scientific account of consciousness. Because some states of consciousness have ontologically subjective modes of existence, like the dollar bill, doesn't mean they cannot be studied by science for something that is epistemically objective. He gives the example, the pain in my toe is ontologically subjective. It is because its mode of existence relies on the subject feeling it. But that doesn't mean to say Professor now has pain in his toe cannot be known epistemically objective. My professor now has pain in his toe. That statement isn't epistemically subjective. That's an objective fact. It is the fact that I am feeling this pain in my toe, and other people can understand it objectively, even though it is created subjectively. The fact that consciousness has a subjective mode of existence, its ontology is subjective, does not prevent us from having an objective science of consciousness, as epistemic objectivity does not preclude ontologically subjectivity as a domain of investigation. Like the $1 bill, we can gain objective knowledge, something that is epistemically objective, from something that we create, which is ontologically subjective. Science does have a problem with subjectivity, and that's one of the reasons we're studying Searle right now. If science only wants to focus on objective facts and objective knowledge, then they seem really limited in the fact that how are they going to explain a dollar bill then from objective facts? Yes, they can talk about the content of cotton. They can talk about its molecular structure. They can talk about the dye that was used and all these material aspects. But can they answer the question, what makes it a dollar bill? That's really difficult, because what makes it a dollar bill is our subjective ontology. We created it. We made it a dollar bill. So it seems science has an issue here in its ability to explain something that's ontologically subjective or ontologically subjective facts. Now, I don't want to get too ahead of myself. I thought that was important for us to really hammer home what he's saying here as far as science, that just because something is ontologically subjective, like consciousness, doesn't mean we can't gain epistemically objective knowledge from it. For our purposes, this part, the ontology and epistemology section, is one of the most important in this entire chapter. So Consciousness was important to get to this state to show that even though consciousness is subjective, it doesn't mean that we can't study it for its epistemically objective knowledge. And then we need to focus on intentionality, because intentionality takes on the rest of the chapters. So I'm going to breeze over the dualism aspect just so you guys don't get lost, and then explain what he means by consciousness as a biological process. But for our purposes, this is the most important part, along with intentionality. So with that, we'll move on to the next slide. Problems with dualism and materialism. And I'll just state right now, Searle is a materialist. He does not believe in Cartesian dualism from Descartes, where the mind is immaterial and the body is material, that the mind and the body are two completely separate entities. He is a materialist, but he's not a materialist in the contemporary sort, and I'll discuss that further. But just to put it out there for our benefit, Searle is a materialist. He just doesn't buy into any of the contemporary materialist arguments. So for dualism, it states, if you think consciousness as some separate, mysterious kind of phenomena distinct from material or physical reality, then it looks like you are forced to what is traditionally called dualism. If you believe the mind is separate from the body in material and form, physical reality, then it looks like you're forced to believe in dualism. And if you are a materialist, then you're forced to say that there really isn't such a thing as consciousness with a first-person subjective ontology. So he briefly brings out the problems with both, and then he goes deeper into each one. So first we have dualism. And there are two kinds of dualism. There's the substance dualism of Descartes, where he believed there are two radically different kinds of entities in this entire universe, the material objects and the immaterial minds. Then you have property dualism, where there are two kinds of properties of objects that are metaphysically distinct. There are physical properties such as weights, and then there are mental properties such as being in pain. So one is universal, and that was Descartes, where he believed, you have two entities in the entire universe, immaterial objects and material objects. And the immaterial refers to the mind, and the material and other material objects like the bodies and entities out there in the world are material. But property dualism is a little bit more contemporary. They believe mental faculties are immaterial. And then you have the material body. So thoughts, pains, hungers, thirst, those are all immaterial properties. And then everything else is material other than thought. The problem with this is we cannot think of any sort of causal interaction between consciousness and the physical world. It's the same problem that we discussed in Descartes, the problem of interactionism. If you have two entirely separate entities, how do they interact with one another? And we obviously interact, because when I have this intention of thirst, when I have this thought of being hungry or thirsty, it acts on my physical body. The whole body feels like it needs to be quenched or replenished. So how is it our mind interacts with our body when there are two completely separate entities? Well, if this problem of interactionism exists, then why is it people still believe in dualism? Well, our inner thoughts seem to belong to us. When we think about the relation of our conscious selves to our bodies, it seems just too horrible to think that there is nothing to ourselves except our bodies. That would mean that when we die, nothing continues to exist. If all we are our material selves, our material bodies, and we know material objects cease to exist, then we will eventually die. So dualism, satisfies a deep urge we have to survive death. This immaterial soul, this immaterial mind that cannot be destroyed, will live on. And that means something to us. And for Searle, that's one of the reasons dualism persists the way it does. Then you have materialism. And Searle goes on to state that most practicing philosophers adhere to some form of materialism, that materialism really is the majority belief nowadays, yet they don't believe in consciousness whatsoever. There are behaviorists that believe the mind is reduced to behaviors and dispositions to behavior. There's physicalism, where mental states are just brain states, that my pain is simply C-fibering stimulus in my mind. And I won't go into all of them. He does talk about a lot of them, functionalism, strong artificial intelligence. And strong artificial intelligence are basically just saying minds are computers, programs that are implemented in the brain. To be in pain is a computer program for that pain. But the important thing is that all contemporary forms of materialism get rid of mental phenomena. They get rid of it in general, and they reduce consciousness to some sort of physical or material entity. For Searle, this is a problem with materialism, because when you deny consciousness, you end up denying the existence of the phenomena that gave rise to the question in the first place. You came up with this question because your consciousness allows you to come up with this question. But now you're denying the very thing that allowed you to question it in the first place. So Searle believes consciousness as being irreducible to mental states does not exist, or, physical mental states does not exist. Because when you're doing this, you're getting rid of the phenomena. This is the problem of reduction, the reduction of consciousness. And we'll go over that in the 6th slide. So why do people believe in materialism? Well, because it's overwhelmingly convincing. Several centuries of scientific advance stating that if there's one thing we know, is that the world consists entirely of physical particles in fields of force. Everything is material. We don't find this immaterial stuff anywhere. And that's also why, Searle is a materialist. But he's a different kind of materialist, because contemporary materialism has problems and dualism has problems. In reference to consciousness, the problem with materialism is that if consciousness is subjective and qualitative, as we stated before in the 3 essential features, then it cannot be part of the material physical world. Because according to the materialists, if all is material, all is this objective material stuff. And yet we know that consciousness is subjective. And consciousness has a quality to it that makes it ontologically subjective. My conscious state, if you reduce my brain to mere C-fibering and the synapses firing within my brain, there's still going to be this subjective element left over that you can't explain, just like the dollar bill. You'll break the dollar bill down into its material substance, but you're not going to be able to tell me what gave rise to its ontologically subjective form or its ontologically subjective creation. You can't tell me what makes it a dollar bill by science alone, and that's the problem with materialism. If materialism believes that consciousness is just part of the physical world, and if it's just part of the physical world and can be broken down into its material components, you're not going to reach this subjectivity. So you're going to just get rid of subjectivity altogether and say consciousness doesn't exist. So that's the problem with materialism. The problem with dualism is the way that Descartes defines the mind and matter, then they are mutually exclusive. If something is mental, it cannot be physical, and vice versa. Consciousness doesn't interact with our bodies. Consciousness is kind of just a byproduct. And he gets into epiphenomenalism later on, and I'll discuss epiphenomenalism because the dualist challenge usually revolves around epiphenomenalism. But for now, just know that the problem with materialism is that they do away with consciousness, and the problem with dualism is the same old interactionism, where if we had consciousness, it wouldn't be able to interact with the body whatsoever. And yet we see consciousness affecting the body all the time. Whether I'm hungry or whether I'm thirsty, there's a conscious state to that being. There is something that it is like to be thirsty. There is something that it is like to be hungry. And this conscious state affects me to the point where I seek out that which will appease that particular conscious state. With that, we'll move on to Searle's materialism as he explains consciousness as a biological process. Consciousness as a biological process. Now, this is going to be a short section. I just included this because I wanted to make sure you guys don't get lost during this lengthy discussion in the chapter. He wants to show that even though consciousness can be wholly material, it doesn't mean that it cannot be studied. He states consciousness is a biological process that occurs in the brain the way that digestion is a biological process that occurs in the stomach and the rest of the digestive tract. Now, you see what he does here. Digestion is subjective. There are things that cause a sore stomach in one person that may not cause a sore stomach in another person. Digestion is the act of various components working together, but it's still a subjective entity. The same thing can be said about consciousness. When things are working together in the brain, it doesn't mean consciousness itself doesn't exist. It does exist, and it exists as a higher level feature of the brain, just the same way that digestion is a higher level feature of the stomach. So Searle goes on to state that the one thing we have to accept before we ever get going in this discussion is the fact that brain processes do cause consciousness. Now, this is not something he's going to invest a lot of time in arguing. It just seems like it's going to be a given. If one day it's proven false, then hey, one day it's proven false. But at this point, more likely than not, consciousness is a brain process. And more importantly, the brain processes cause consciousness. So now subjectivity does not prevent consciousness from being a higher level feature of the brain in the same way that digestion is a higher level feature of the stomach. It can still exist as part of the brain process, just like digestion is caused by all the functions of the stomach working together. Consciousness is caused by all the processes in the brain working together. So he states that if you grant me that consciousness with all its subjectivity is caused by a process in the brain, and grant me that conscious states are themselves a higher level feature of the brain, then there is no metaphysical mind and body problem. We don't have the mind and body problem of dualism because consciousness is a material component to brain processes created by brain processes. And we don't have a problem with contemporary materialism because it's just a higher level feature of the brain, just like digestion is. And while digestion is subjective, it can still be studied in a causal interaction of the way the stomach works, all the inner components working together that promotes the higher level feature of digestion. The brain processes working together promote the higher level feature of consciousness. When my body recognizes a deficiency, it lets my brain know that I am thirsty. My conscious state, this higher level feature, lets everything know that I'm thirsty and to seek out sustenance. So with this, he kind of does away with the mind-to-body problems by explaining consciousness as a biological process. So if I ask you in a test, what does he mean by consciousness as being a biological process that occurs in the brain, explain that the same way digestion works, where all the components are working together to promote digestion, the consciousness is all the components of the brain working together that promote or create consciousness. Because as he stated, brain processes cause consciousness. And with that, we're going to move into the irreducibility of consciousness. The irreducibility of consciousness. So according to Searle, consciousness has a first-person ontology. That's a subjective ontology. We give rise to consciousness. We create consciousness. Consciousness in its entirety relies on my mode of existence in order to exist. So it has a first-person ontology, so it cannot be reduced to or eliminated in favor of phenomena with a third-person ontology. And what he's saying here is that somebody outside of me cannot look at my brain and break down all the components of the brain to explain consciousness in its entirety. One example that's often used is the bat example. Say you have a bat, and by bat I mean a flying mammal, not a wooden club. Now, if you try to explain a bat purely as a third-person ontology, you're going to say it's often moves around during the night, it senses things with sonar. You look at the components of the brain and you figure out what kind of behavior correlates to what kind of fiber firing. Even if you explain all these things to the best of your knowledge, there's still going to be a subjective component left over. And that subjective component is what it is like to be a bat. No matter how much you explain away, you are not going to get rid of consciousness by reducing it to component parts. There will always be a subjective element left over even after we have given a complete causal account of neurobiological factors or neurobiological basis. We will never know what it is like to be a bat. If you took my brain components and you broke them down to neurobiological behaviors and synapses firing, you still won't answer the question of what it's like to be Professor Punuai, what it's like to be you. There is always a subjective element left over because guess what? Consciousness exists as a subjective ontology. And with that, Searle moves on to talk about two kinds of reductions, although he's already said, you cannot reduce consciousness. But nevertheless, he does discuss two kinds of reductions often used in science. One is eliminative, and the other one is non-eliminative. So the first one, the eliminative reduction, gets rid of phenomena by showing that it really doesn't exist, that it was an illusion. It eliminates the phenomena. And to give you an example, if you explain the theory of a sunrise, all right, the way the sun rises in the morning, after you explain all the components associated with the sunrise, you actually eliminate a sunrise in its entirety because the sun is not actually rising. The way our planet orbits the sun produces the illusion that the sun rises over the ocean. So when you reduce something in an eliminative way, you eliminate the phenomena completely. And then there's the non-eliminative reductionist. It tries to explain the phenomena causally so that it is defined by those causal bases. Take solidity, for example. You can explain the entirety of solidity in its causal terms. the vibrations of the molecules, the lattice structures. It basically redefines solidity in terms of the causal basis that occurs, the chain of causation that occurs to solidify something. You haven't gotten rid of solidity and shown it to be merely an illusion. No, in fact, you've redefined solidity in terms of the causal chain of events that occur in order for something to solidify. So you have these two elements of reductions. One eliminates, the other one doesn't eliminate. But you can't make any of these moves with consciousness. That is why he says consciousness is irreducible. You can't eliminate consciousness and show that it is an illusion, because the existence of the illusion is the reality itself. You can't get rid of consciousness, because guess what? You're using consciousness in order to try to get rid of consciousness. And even more so, if it seems to me that I am conscious, then I am. I'm in at least one state of consciousness. Even if I'm dreaming, there's at least a state of consciousness that I am completely in. And when I'm awake, there's an aspect of consciousness of what it means to be awake. I may have illusions of the sun setting behind the mountains, but I can in no way have the illusion of the consciousness that I am in fact conscious right now, or in one particular conscious state, And then so there's the non-eliminative reductionist. Performs a reduction to a causal basis. So basically a chain of events. But now we run into that subjectivity problem. You can't explain consciousness purely on causal basis. You cannot break down consciousness into neurobiological factors, because there's always this subjective piece that's left over. And that's important to know. We cannot reduce consciousness, because in the eliminative way, you're going to show that it's an illusion, but you're never going to show consciousness as an illusion, because guess what? You're using consciousness in order to come to the theory or understanding that it may be an illusion. And you can't use a non-eliminative reductionist method, because there's always going to be this subjective element left over. And that's what he means when he says consciousness is irreducible. Now, even though it's not vital, I do believe I should take the time here to talk about epiphenomenalism, because explaining consciousness as a biological process, some people will say maybe consciousness is just this leftover stuff from our brain working the way it works causally within a system. So epiphenomenalism is the theory that consciousness in this particular aspect, if they're talking epiphenomenalism as it refers to consciousness, they're saying consciousness is a byproduct. One of the best examples I can give is if you imagine a steamboat, and you have all the inner workings of the engine component that produce the thrust for the steamboat to move across the river. And then the steam that is pouring out of the chimney, I don't really know what they call it on a boat, but regardless, the smoke that's produced doesn't do anything. The smoke doesn't produce the thrust, at least the smoke that's billowing doesn't produce the thrust. The smoke is merely a byproduct from the inner workings of the steamboat. So many will say, especially the dualists, will challenge that they can grant that consciousness is a higher feature of the brain, and that the brain's inner workings are a lower feature. But that means that we must accept epiphenomenalism. Yes, they do make this argument, because they're saying, the way the brain works and the way it causally interacts with neurobiological C-firing and the synapses firing and all these inner workings, consciousness is just a byproduct of all these lower level functions. And Searle disagrees with this, because in order for it to be epiphenomenal, then consciousness, being just a byproduct, doesn't affect our decisions, doesn't affect the way the mind operates, and is just useless piece of leftover stuff. Searle briefly just says, this would be miraculous, unlike anything that has ever occurred in biological history, if something as elaborate, rich, and structured as human and animal consciousness actually made no causal difference in the world. Then Searle gives his own example with a car engine, saying that at one level you have the actions of the pistons, the cylinders, the compression of the gas-oxygen mixture that fires and creates the combustion and rotation of the pistons to turn the drive shaft, and the engine goes. On another level, you have the molecular structure of the engine block itself. The movement of the molecules that produces the solidity and other movements that produce oxidation, the passage of electrons across the electrodes. So you have this other level that is working and is necessary for the engine to stay solid and not melt into a little puddle, at a molecular level. But these two distinct levels of description do not denote a inconsistency between the two. Just because at one level you have all this motion that produces thrust, and then you have this other level, this molecular level that keeps the solidity of the engine block, doesn't mean that these two are inconsistent from one another. They are working causally together, and showing the causal efficacy of consciousness is not threatened by pointing out that any explanation at the level of consciousness is grounded in more fundamental physical processes. That was the point here. Searle shows that consciousness can be thought of as a biological process, but just because it's thought of as a biological process, by no means it's just merely a byproduct due to that biological process. It is not redundant. It is not insignificant. Consciousness is a very significant part of our lives. And just because he is a materialist, showing that consciousness could be a causally related biological process, like digestion is to the stomach, doesn't mean that it's epiphenomenal whatsoever. Epiphenomenal kind of shows insignificance of consciousness, and that's dangerous, according to Searle. But like I said, this is not a philosophy of science class, so I just wanted to explain this so you guys aren't lost. I may ask you to explain what the non-reduction of consciousness means, or I may ask you what's the difference between eliminative and non-eliminative reductions, but I won't ask you for the elaborate definition of consciousness or how epiphenomenalism refers to consciousness as a biological state. With that said, this next part is important, especially for the later chapters of Searle, because now he finally brings up what's called intentionality. And with that, we'll move on to the next slide. Consciousness, intentionality, and causation. Searle states that a conscious state, such as an intention or a desire, functions by representing the sort of event that it causes. Basically, when my body wants to drink water, it brings up this conscious state of being thirsty. So the conscious state forces me to seek out that intention or desired function within the world to cessate that feeling or that need to drink water. So I go and I drink water. So the effect, drinking water, is consciously represented by the cause, the desire to drink water. And he finds that absolutely fascinating because at a philosophical level, it's like we have this idea of consciousness, this subjective idea of consciousness, but we are able to represent our needs to things in the world. And he finds that fascinating. That's that intentional causation that he talks about. It's an amazing property that conscious beings have to represent objects and state of affairs in the world and to act on the basis of those representations. In fact, to the point where we take things for granted that this water will quench my thirst. even as Hume has shown, that's really just taking for granted a uniformity principle, and we have no evidence to believe in the uniformity principle other than the uniformity principle itself. With this, Searle moves on to discuss intentionality. And when he says intentionality, he means the features of the mind by which mental states are directed at, or about, or refer to, or aim at states of affairs in the world. When our consciousness points us in the direction towards the world, that is intentionality. There's an intention or desired function. There is a basis to those desires. There is a need that we are trying to fulfill. So intentionality comes into play when consciousness is directing you towards state of affairs in the world. But he says not all conscious states are intentional, and not all intentional states are conscious. So he gives some examples of the non-intentional forms of consciousness, the consciousness that isn't about something in the world, conscious feelings with no intention. For example, when we experience anxiety or elation for no reason, where I have an anxious feeling and somebody is like, "Well, what are you anxious about?" And I was like, "I have no idea. I just started feeling this way." This is a conscious feeling that doesn't have intention to it. It doesn't have a desired fit. It's not directed at anything. It doesn't refer to anything. And is definitely not pointed at any state of affair in the world. It's just this feeling that has come over me out of nowhere, and I have no idea what it's pointing to. It's just the way I feel right now. And then he discusses intentionality that are unconscious. Intentionality with no consciousness. And that's, when I have hopes, feelings, and fears, even when I'm sleeping. I'm unconscious when I'm sleeping, but I can still have fears in the form of nightmares. I can still have feelings. I can still have hopes in this unconscious state. So I have intentionality because there is a fear towards something or directing at some type of state or affair. And it may not be in the world. Hey, it may be in the world, because when I'm dreaming, I could have a fear of spiders, for example. And even though the spider is completely in my mind, there is still a intention or state of affair that it's directed at in the world. But still, it still has intentionality, but it's no longer conscious. So, though not all conscious states are intentional and not all intentional states are conscious, there is an essential connection. We only understand intentionality in terms of consciousness. And he wants to explore the structure of consciousness and the structure of intentionality later on. But let's discuss what this really means. The essential connection between intentionality and consciousness. I have to have a form of a conscious state in order to have intentions whatsoever. If I am going to have a mental state that's directed at or refer to the world, there has to be a conscious being to have intention. Whether I am unconscious or when I'm sleeping or when I'm conscious when I'm awake, there's still a state of consciousness within the two, whether it's within my own mind or I'm reflecting to the world. There has to be a conscious being in order for there to be intentionality. A rock can't have intentionality. A house can't have intentionality. It can't have a desired aim. It can't have a state of affairs which it is directed at the world because it doesn't have consciousness. We can only understand intentionality in terms of consciousness. The idea that our intentionality is trying to fit the world, trying to aim at or refer to state of affairs only makes sense if the being that this intentionality originated from is a conscious being. Like I said, it wouldn't make sense if it was a rock. It wouldn't make sense if it was a house. It only makes sense as intentions or desired functions come from a conscious being. So this week we have a quiz. I may have made a mistake last week by announcing the quiz, but I did announce that it's supposed to be this week, and it will consist of both Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. So particularly for this chapter, study the differences between epistemology, subjective and objective epistemology, or what is subjectively and objectively epistemically known, and the difference between something that is ontologically objective versus something that's ontologically subjective. It's very important to know those two distinctions. Understand what we mean by the reduction of consciousness, where one is non-eliminative and the other one is eliminative. And then, of course, you need to know what intentionality means. So, as usual, post a discussion, post a response. If you've made your 10, excellent. You guys are good for the year. And I'll see you next week.